So yeah, today I'd like to talk about the Anthropocene and give you some of my ideas about the validity of this concept. But before I launch into that, I just want to give you, first of all, a picture of the region where I live. It's very lovely, of course. This is the Lake Geneva with the Alps in the background. But what I think you should notice here is this kind of landscape that you see in the foreground. And this is a cultural landscape. This is an engineered landscape. And I think when I give this lecture to audiences in Europe, it's generally quite obvious that most of us live in landscapes that have been strongly modified through human action, not in the last decade or the last century, but really over the last hundreds or even thousands of years. So this kind of landscape here is at least 1,000 years old, but people have been living there much longer, even developing this landscape for agriculture. In this case, it happens to be a very good place to grow grapes to make wine. And these kind of engineered landscapes exist, of course, not only in Europe, but all over the world. Just another example of a landscape that people went through great lengths to develop, to manage, and to maintain these rice terraces here in southern China, which also are about 800 years old. So this is something to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation. Before I continue, I really just have to acknowledge that a lot of the work that I'm going to present to you today is indeed the result of long-term collaborations with many of my doctoral students, postdocs, and other researchers I've worked with in my own group and in groups around the world. So thank you very much to them, and also thank you to the funding agencies that, of course, gave me the money to do this kind of research. So what am I interested in? One of my main research interests is in the role of land cover in the Earth system. And I think it goes without saying that the Earth's land surface plays an important role in the Earth system, in the climate system, through biogeophysical and biogeochemical feedbacks between land and atmosphere. So the actual physical properties of the Earth's surface and the greenhouse gases and aerosols that are emitted by that surface are very important. And we also think we know that the land surface changed greatly over the late Quaternary, certainly over the last million years. If you'd be standing here, right here, 21,000 years ago, you'd be crushed by a giant ice sheet, or you'd be right at the edge of a giant ice sheet. So this is something that is dynamic on say, millennial to multimillennial timescales. And if we think about more recent time, we know that both climate and human activities influence land cover, but really the focus of a lot of my research recently has been about understanding the relative importance of these over time. And this is very highly debated, this last point there on that slide. So in the context of that, I'd like to talk to you today about what I call the 5 land use revolutions, and the way in which humans have changed the Earth's land surface, which ultimately affected the climate system as a product of our changing relationship with the environment over time, with the physical environment, and how these major developments in human history really changed the way we modified our environment. These led, of course, to land cover changes, not only in the recent past or at the present, but also over much longer timescales that influence the state of the Earth system at the present day. So in order to kind of start thinking about this, I think we need to imagine what the world was like without us, or what the world was like more correctly before us. And what was the world like before us? Well, in order to think about that, we need to go back at least 200,000 years ago to sort of the evolution of anatomically modern humans, where we sort of emerged in southern and eastern Africa sometime around this period. But it's also important, or probably instructive, to notice that the eastern hemisphere, at least, was occupied by other hominin species that used tools, that had some kind of social interaction, and may have even had the capability to practice a kind of limited form of environmental modification, or niche construction, if you want, throughout Eurasia and Africa, even at the dawn of our own evolution. And if we fast forward 50,000 years or so to the penultimate glacial maximum, so not the last glacial maximum, but the one that happened before that, 150,000 years ago. We don't see too many changes in the distribution of these hominid species or our own species over that time. And it really isn't until we get into the last glacial cycle. So here's the last interglacial, still not that much has changed. Once we get into the last glacial cycle, starting around 90,000 years ago, things really start to change. And probably by this time, there have already been a few successive waves. The latest archaeological evidence is giving us information that modern humans probably left Africa before this time, although those early emigrations were not as successful as the ones that come in the context of the last glacial cycle. And the real key period then here is really this period, what we call marine isotope stage 3, the period between about 30,000 and about 60,000 years ago, when humans start rapidly expanding across the eastern hemisphere in the context of these extremely abrupt and high magnitude climate changes. The kind of climate change that we're experiencing now is still really nothing compared to the kind of climate changes between very cold glacial phases and sort of intermediate interstadial phases that occurred during marine isotope stage 3. Perhaps, hopefully not, but perhaps we will experience a rapid and abrupt climate change like this during the next few centuries. But nevertheless, you can imagine that this was a period which made the environment in many ways difficult for people to deal with, and one of the ways that they responded to that very rapidly changing environment was to themselves very rapidly occupy different parts of the world in which they lived at that time, and in fact the Eastern Hemisphere. So that by 60,000 people had probably almost reached Australia, and certainly by 21,000 years ago, at the last glacial maximum, humans are living across the entire Eastern Hemisphere with the exception of a few large islands like Madagascar and New Zealand. So when we start thinking about human impact on the Earth system, perhaps we really need to be thinking about not just the last century, not just the last millennia, but we need to go back as far as the time of our expansion across the entire Eastern Hemisphere, so somewhere around the last glacial maximum. Now, what is it about the last glacial maximum? Here again, sort of a proxy of climate. It's a Greenland climate, so it's not really global climate, but it does give you an idea of what the last glacial maximum is like. It was probably not the coldest period during the last glacial cycle, but it was a period of relatively stable climate over a long time. So about 5,000 or 6,000 years of really cold glacial climate. And I just written that on here. It's distinguished as the period with the largest ice extent, so the lowest sea level. And it's also been a focus of a lot of Earth system modeling as having a period for simulation in which the world was in a very different state than it was today. What do we know about last glacial maximum vegetation? Well, the kind of canonical view of last glacial maximum vegetation, particularly in the European context, is one of a kind of treeless tundra landscape, that Europe was just an open landscape, perhaps not completely open because there were also interesting megafauna living on that landscape we know very well that may have influenced the vegetation and certainly made the environment a little bit more interesting than just this kind of tundra that we see today. And these kind of results are really influenced by our ability to reconstruct paleo environment, in this case using pollen data, and already now more than 20 years ago, the first sort of large-scale synthesis of pollen data at Europe kind of presented this picture of Europe covered by, again, this kind of treeless tundra-like landscape, okay? But when we take climate models and we simulate the climate of the last glacial maximum, when we use that to inform a vegetation model, we end up with a vegetation cover of Europe that looks more like this. It's much more forested, it's much more trees than what the pollen data would suggest. And this presents a kind of conundrum. What's going on here? Are the pollen data wrong? Are the models wrong? Well, I would argue that perhaps these type of models are missing something important about the landscape of last glacial maximum Europe. And what they're missing is the presence of humans. And this rather over-exaggerated picture of people driving horses off a cliff is maybe illustrative for me of what's going on in the background here. And that is the idea that these people were using fire as a tool for managing their landscape, in this case improving their hunting opportunities. And we actually know that people lived nearly everywhere in Europe during the last glacial maximum. This is just a compilation of archaeological sites dated to the last glacial maximum, and what you can see here is there's evidence that people are living even very close to the ice sheets, to the major ice sheets at the LGM. So based on this information, we were able to put together in a recent study a model of human population dynamics and simulate the presence of humans on the landscape as a function of vegetation primary productivity. So people more or less can live in any landscape that has a minimum amount of productivity, and then also on the openness of the landscape. And many studies have shown that humans tend to like to live in diverse landscapes. They don't like to live in completely barren, open, treeless landscapes, nor do they prefer to live in very dense forests. The best place where humans can live is some kind of intermediate level here. And I'll just going to point out that the line here, or the threshold here for habitability, comes somewhere around the point where we would imagine the boreal tree line to be. So on the basis of this kind of carrying capacity calculation, we were able to simulate the density of people living in Europe during glacial maximum time. And what we interestingly see here is that our model predicts the best places for people to live also happens to be the places where you find the highest density of archaeological sites. For example, in the southwest of France or in the northeast of Spain. Interestingly, it also suggests that people would have lived in southern Italy, for example, where we have less archaeological evidence for their presence. So there may be some interesting things going on here. We're able to take this data set now, the simulation of population, and put that into a model that simulates the way people can manage their landscapes using fire. And that model takes into account the characteristics of the vegetation, the way in which fire behaves in that vegetation, and importantly, these human ignitions to understand how fire as a disturbance can change vegetation composition. So why would humans have burned in the past? Well, as I mentioned, hunter-gatherers like semi-open landscapes because it gives them habitat diversity for prey, it helps them ease mobility, and so on. And so we implement that in a model, in a mathematical way, by linking the annual amounts that foragers try to burn to the simulated degree of landscape openness. So people like the way their landscape is, they don't burn too much, but if it has a lot of trees in it, they try to burn those trees down to open it up a little bit, okay? And so on the other hand, if they try to burn those trees down, but it's too wet all the time and they don't succeed, then they'll effectively give up. So on the basis of this kind of formulation, which I'm happy to explain in more detail afterwards if you have more questions, we're able to simulate the amount of fire caused by humans in Europe in glacial maximum times. And what we effectively have here is a modest increase in the mean annual burned area and the amount of fire occurring, okay, compared to a simulation without people. It's 2 to 8% more fire on an annual basis. But that fire actually has a fairly substantial impact on the vegetation because the vegetation, especially the tree cover of last glacial maximum Europe, was stressed by low temperatures and low carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. And so when we put people into the simulation, it causes a big opening of the landscape. So it's humans, hunter-gatherers using fire, opening up that landscape as a way of maintaining or managing their landscape. And this type of result, I would argue, matches better to more contemporary reconstructions of tree cover that we're able to do using pollen data. So climate simulations for the last glacial maximum Europe show large differences between models, but much of Europe might have been suitable for human occupation and also for forest during the LGM. So how do we explain this conundrum? Human application of fire to wooded landscapes opens up those landscapes, and it not only helps reconcile models with these reconstructions of land cover, but what it also suggests is that humans were having a measurably substantial impact on global or continental scale vegetation cover already 21,000 years ago. So think about that when you start thinking about what is the Anthropocene. The other thing we can do is we can expand these simulations to look at the entire world, and in this case, here you have it. Of course, there were no humans living in the Western Hemisphere at the last glacial maximum. They're migration was effectively blocked by the presence of these very large ice sheets, but we do see human-caused fire all over the Eastern Hemisphere, including in Australia, and that causes a concomitant reduction in tree cover. So in the absence of people and with people on the landscape, what you'll see if you look particularly in the boreal regions is a big reduction in the forest cover caused by humans. So was this the beginning of the Anthropocene? Maybe. Should I stop talking now? I'll keep going. These kind of anthropogenic transformations may have been some of the very earliest and first large-scale transformations that occurred. Let's move on to the beginning of the Holocene. Now, once people have spread not only throughout the Eastern Hemisphere, but into the Western Hemisphere, then we really can start thinking about global human impact. And I just want to take one little quick detour to talk about the deforestation of New Zealand, because this is one of the cases in which I think we have a very obvious example of how small group of people can change the vegetation of a relatively large landscape very quickly. So the Maori arrive in the second half, in New Zealand, in the second half of the 13th century, and they came as a small group. It was probably a planned migration, but it still can't have been more than a few hundred people in the beginning. But yet, pollen-based land cover reconstructions give us this indication that before they arrived, New Zealand looks largely like this, and sometime after they arrive, or when Europeans first arrived, the land cover of New Zealand is substantially different. It's much, much less forest cover. We also see from charcoal and pollen data that there's a big increase in the amount of fire that comes with the arrival of humans in New Zealand right around 1380 AD, okay? And what could be causing that? Well, we don't think it was climate, because lightning is extremely rare in the New Zealand context. In the last decade, there are parts of New Zealand that have never had a lightning strike, okay? And so what we're trying to do is test this hypothesis. What could humans have done to the landscapes of New Zealand? How many people would it have taken, and over what period of time, in order to change the vegetation cover so substantially? And so we're doing that in a series of simulations. In this case, I'm just showing you some very early results of the northwest, where we were just running a model on the northeastern part of the South Island of New Zealand, the Canterbury and Marlborough regions. And what I'm going to show you in this animation is the tree cover of New Zealand, of this part of New Zealand here, and the amount of fire in the same region around the time of the simulated arrival of the Maori. So we'll just play this through, and you see not much is happening until we get to that red bar, and then now people come, and there's all of a sudden a lot more fire in the landscape and a substantial reduction in the forest cover over that period as well. And so this is ongoing research. What you're seeing here is just kind of the first attempt to do this sort of thing. But basically, the idea here is that humans, even relatively few humans, coming onto a landscape that was relatively vulnerable and sensitive to fire, sensitive to disturbance caused by fire, could have created a much larger amount of burn area and a big reduction in the forest cover. And here's just the top line is just the density of people. So we're still talking about extremely low population densities. So I think I've already summarized this part reasonably well, but fire in New Zealand is rare. When humans arrive, they cause a large opening of the forest, but it appears to be temporary. So one of the things that we're working on is the idea that perhaps not by chance, perhaps because the winds were blowing in the right direction, humans arrive in New Zealand during the so-called medieval climate anomaly, or the medieval warm period, a period in Earth's history when climate was a little bit warmer than what came afterwards. And that sort of combination of people arriving and the climate being cooperative might have been the trigger or the condition, the precondition that allowed them to create this permanent change in vegetation cover. Let's move on to another enigma. Holocene, carbon dioxide, and methane. Something is interesting or unusual about the Holocene. And that is to say that when we look at ice core records of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, in particular carbon dioxide and methane, what we see is this interesting departure from the so-called natural trend. And this natural trend we can build based on looking at the interglacials, the warm periods for which we have records, ice core records of greenhouse gases for all of the previous interglacial periods, so not just the Holocene. And what we see here is this departure from this natural trend somewhere between 8,000 years ago for carbon dioxide and 6,000 years ago for methane. And it was Bill Redeman, the oceanographer, who already now about 15 years ago suggested that this unusual departure in the trend of these two greenhouse gases, long before the Industrial Revolution, was related to human activity. Okay? So the first thing we can ask then is, well, what human activities emit greenhouse gases that could have led to this anomalous departure? Well, already probably about 10,000 years ago, we developed pottery, and some even pre-agricultural societies, for example, in Japan, used pottery extensively, and this created demand for fuel wood, which could have led to permanent deforestation or at least loss of carbon stocks in certain ecosystems, okay? Because you need wood, you obviously need fuel to fire kilns and to fire clay pots. We domesticated animals, which changed certainly the density of large ruminants on the landscape, also led to methane emissions. We discovered metallurgy, which again created demand for wood. We mastered things like wet rice cultivation, revolutionized our agricultural techniques, and all of these things led to urbanization and the development of complex societies, which would have potentially emitted greenhouse gases to the atmosphere in substantial quantities in pre-industrial time. Okay? So all of this happens long before the Industrial Revolution. So the real question here then is, well, how much impact or influence could this actually have had on the global carbon cycle or the global cycles of greenhouse gases? So in that context, the second land use revolution, if the first was fire, the second is certainly the development of agriculture and pastoralism. So as people completely changed their lifestyle and became sedentary farmers or even mobile pastoralists, as I mentioned, we changed the way we use land, and we can start to estimate precisely how that happened over time. We can think about how many people could have been sustained by, say, 4,000 hectares of land, 5 hunter-gatherers versus 875 farmers in a more intense farming society. But nevertheless, as I mentioned already, some of these low-intensity forms of land use have an impact on the landscape that we should not ignore. So things like managed fire maybe even are underestimated in a lot of our understanding of anthropogenic imprint on land cover. Displacement of fauna, introduction of new species, and certainly things like managed forests or extensive pasture land can change carbon and biomass in soils and so on. So we talked about fire, talked about agriculture and pastoralism. The third land use revolution must be metallurgy. The development of metal tools really fundamentally changes the relationship between humans and their environment. Suddenly now, you have much easier ways of sawing up or cutting down trees, or harvesting crops, or plowing soils, okay, or tilling soils. So that allows new forms of landscape to be open to human exploitation. But at the same time, it creates a demand for fuel wood, again, for metals, metal recovery, so mining, and metal smelting and metal working. And certainly in some parts of the world, this led to permanent deforestation and land degradation, things like soil erosion, which would have led to a permanent loss of carbon from the terrestrial biosphere, which would have ended up in the atmosphere or the oceans. So we had farming, we had fire, we had farming, we had metallurgy. The fourth land use revolution that comes before the Industrial Revolution is trade. Large-scale trade in bulk commodities is not a modern phenomenon. Already during the empires of classical antiquity, people were moving around ships full of food. Big cities existed in places they never could have, like Rome, if they had to be supported only by the material only by the food that could be grown in the immediate surroundings. And this is kind of one nice evidence we have for this, for example, is the so-called Monte Testaccio in Rome. It is an artificial mountain built up over about a 100-year period on the refuse of 53 million ceramic amphorae that were used to transport olive oil, largely from Spain to Rome during the Roman period. Okay, so this is a massive dump, a waste heap, if you want. Okay, and that gives you a sort of graphical indication of the sort of scale that this long distance trade in commodities actually had during classical antiquity. And there have been some interesting studies by that, including this one by Brian Dermody, thinking about the imports and exports of food around the Mediterranean during the Roman era. So this is a not insignificant long-distance influence of humans on land cover through their land use. The other thing that we've seen in the midst by doing a very detailed examination of archaeological information, in this case from the Peloponnese in southern Greece, is that the diversification written at the bottom here is, I won't have time to go through this entire picture here, but what you effectively see is in the stacked bar graph is per capita land use over time. And what's happening is, despite the fact that there are technological innovations, despite the fact that there are social innovations like divisions of labor that in one sense you might imagine would drive down per capita land use, they'd allow you to feed more people on the same space at any given time, a sort of green revolution. What our models are suggesting is that people actually use more and more land over time. And the reason why they use more and more land is because of this diversification of economic activity. The fact that in the Neolithic, the pre-metal time, people didn't need to set aside any landscape for exploitation of forest resources, for fuel wood, for running smelting or metalworking. Okay, in the Bronze Age they need more, in the Iron Age they need even more. They also do things like eat more and more meat, so we've been talking about that in the contemporary context. As societies eat more and more meat, we need more and more land to support the global human population. Well, this sort of thing actually happened already 4 millennia ago in the Eastern Mediterranean. People were expanding their ecological footprint through the diversification of economic activities and the fact that they consumed more animal products. So I already went through this, people emit greenhouse gases through these different processes, and so really now what I want to show you in the next few minutes is sort of where we are with this kind of understanding of could human activities have led to this anomalous rise in greenhouse gases. And finally, I'll wrap up by talking to you a little bit about where we're going with this type of research in the future, sort of the future of these studies. What we really need to do in order to say something definitive or convincing, I'm not sure we can really say anything definitive. This is clearly, studying the distant past like this is something that clearly has a lot of uncertainty associated with it. But if we want to say something convincing, what we need to do is quantify the relative importance of these different human activities in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where a lot of this carbon cycle and vegetation modeling work that I've been involved in has come from. We have something called ALCC, or anthropogenic land cover change, and that is the idea that obviously a lot of land cover change, as I've brought you up to this point, is caused through human action in various different ways, starting with hunter-gatherers, opening landscapes using fire, going through agriculture, metallurgy, and things like long-distance trade. In the past, we tried to understand how land cover changed through human action in a very empirical way. And so here I just have an example from some of my very early work on this, where we took forest cover information, or let's say reconstructions of forest cover for different countries, and we tried to link those to population density, okay, in these different countries over time. And what we came up with was this kind of sigmoidal relationship that suggests there's a non-linear relationship between human population and land use over time. Given this relationship, which effectively allows us to say, if we know the density of people living in a particular country at a particular time. Here's the amount of land that they'll be using. The next question would be, where is their land use actually occurring? And in the case of this scenario that we put together, this very simple empirical model, we used information on soils and climates to determine land suitability for cultivation and pasture. Putting that all together led to the so-called KK10 scenario of anthropogenic, Holocene anthropogenic land cover change. And perhaps some of you have already seen this animation. Now you can see it again for a second, where we're seeing here the land use change over time. And I have to sort of put land use in quotation because this is land use defined in a very vague way. So it doesn't necessarily always mean deforestation, because obviously not all of these parts of the world where land use is occurring would naturally be densely forested. Okay? But it still gives you an idea of how much humans modified the Earth's land surface up to the Industrial Revolution. And these redder areas, and I apologize if anyone here is red-green colorblind like my son, I should throw out these animations and make them in a new color scale so that you can appreciate them. But if you have questions, please ask me afterwards. Nevertheless, what we see here is a fairly large fraction of the total Earth's land surface that's influenced by human activities up to the Industrial Revolution. And so we're able to use this kind of information in a wide range of studies. Here, for example, one about anthropogenically induced soil erosion as a result of land use. So if we imagine that in places where the landscape would naturally be forest, if people are causing deforestation through their land use, that exposes soils to the atmosphere, to the elements, which could lead to soil erosion. And so what you're seeing here in this map is the cumulative soil loss due to soil erosion and the global annual soil loss occurring over time. And effectively, it's a kind of linear increase in soil loss that is related to larger and larger areas coming under human land use. What you do see here, which I don't really like about this map, since why you see it's unpublished at the bottom there, is that most of that erosion is concentrated in mountain areas. And I think that, as I showed you in my very first two slides of my presentation, in mountain areas, if people are going to undertake some kind of land use, they must do that in a way that mitigates soil erosion or loss of material for lots of material for cultivation. So in some places, in some cases, yes, people would have deforested land to create pasture and steep landscapes, and that could have led to sort of uncontrolled soil erosion, but I think that this is an overestimate in general. Nevertheless, these kind of results are important for the global carbon cycle, and what we actually think is that human-induced erosion has offset some of the deforestation-related carbon emissions. Now, why is that? This is interesting, actually. It's because some of that erosion, some of that sediment that is being transported from hill slopes is being buried in hill slope soils, in colluvium, and in riverine soils, in alluvium. And in those sedimentary systems, carbon in soils has a much longer residence time than it would have in an upland landscape. The other thing that happens is a concept called dynamic replacement, and that is to say that as soil is leaving the upland landscapes, more nutrients are coming up from depth, which are stimulating the sequestration of new carbon in that mineral material, which is now exposed to the atmosphere. So at the same time that you have burial of carbon in alluvium and colluvium, you have a replenishment of carbon in the areas where soil erosion is happening. Now, this obviously doesn't happen everywhere because there are areas where there's, if you go to parts of the Mediterranean, for example, you will see places where there's simply no soil left at all. Okay, so there can't be much carbon left there, but in many other places, this dynamic replacement processes could be important. The other thing that we can see is that land use had big effects on things, on other kinds of natural disturbance. And if we think about the European context and we think about the Holocene, the only way to explain the patterns that we see in sedimentary charcoal, which is a proxy for fire occurrence or fire activity, is through human-induced land cover change. Okay, so we can think about Holocene climate, we can think about changes in temperature or precipitation or vegetation productivity, but nothing really explains the way that we see charcoal changing in sediments better than land use. Okay, that was the conclusion of this study. We can also see at the scale of Europe and at global scale that land use has measurable effects on climate. And so what we're seeing here at the top are simulations for 1800, and this on the left column here for winter and summer, these are climate model simulations. On the left here, we have the so-called Hyde land use scenario, which at 1800 has no land use. Okay, so it's almost like a control simulation. And so there's very little change in climate here between the control and this land use scenario. To the contrary, when we use the KK10 scenario, which I showed you in the animation a few slides ago, what we see is substantial amounts of cooling during winter and an interesting pattern of warmer and cooler temperatures during summertime related to the change, so deforestation of the landscape and conversion to agriculture, which changes the partitioning of latent versus sensible heat. So in summertime in particular, this is important. So if we change landscape from forest to agriculture, in summertime we have increase in temperature because we have an increase in sensible heat versus latent heat, so there's less evapotranspiration. In Northern Europe and Southern Europe, it's actually albedo effect that's more important. So we have an area that would not normally have much evapotranspiration, but now that surface is brighter, and so more solar radiation is reflected to the atmosphere. So these are pre-industrial changes in climate that occurred caused by human activity that are not insignificant and that are sort of relevant for human activities. So one of the things we can do, though, is we can look at the results given by these two different land use scenarios. And I said this Hyde scenario at 1800 effectively has no land use in it. But it's a scenario that we should perhaps take seriously because it was put together by serious scientists. And so we'd really like to know whether or not which one of these two scenarios is more realistic. And how can we do that? Well, one of the ways we can do that is we can use pollen data. Unfortunately, for Northwestern Europe, we have quite a lot of pollen data that's been collected and synthesized over the last 50 years or so. And so we have enough data that we can't make a complete reconstruction of land cover using pollen, but at least we can. These are the pollen-based land cover reconstructions for two periods here on the left for the Middle Holocene, around 6,000 years ago, and for the Bronze Age time around 3,000 years ago. And what you see here are land cover reconstructions for this so-called reveals pollen-based method. And we can compare that to the land cover scenario, the anthropogenic land cover change scenario that I presented to you in the animation. We can look at the differences on a grid cell by grid cell level, but what's probably more instructive is simply to regress one against the other. And so here we have on the x-axis in these two scatter plots the pollen inferred openness of the landscape. And on the y-axis we have the modeled from the anthropogenic land cover change scenario openness of the landscape. And what we can see here clearly is that this KK10 scenario seems to match the pollen-based reconstructions much better than the Hyde scenario, which systematically underestimates the amount of landscape openness. Okay? So that gives us an indication that the KK10 scenario is actually probably more realistic. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up now. I realize I'm running out of time. I'm just going to finish up now with a little bit of where we're going with this in the future, and it'll be short. So just bear with me. So we might believe KK10 more than we believe Hyde, and here's just another example for AD 1200. Okay, so this isn't that long ago. It's only 800 years ago, and what we see here is a huge contrast between these two different scenarios. Again, Hyde suggests there was hardly any land use in all of sub-Saharan Africa at this period, which I find very hard to believe. KK10 suggests there was some, but it also has some strange artifacts in here. You see country boundaries, and you see some kind of other weird patterns, and so we don't really like this empirical approach that I described to you before, where we simply drive the model with an estimate of past population and come up with a deforestation or land use estimate on the basis of that. And what we really need to do is acknowledge that there's only so much we can infer on the basis of the properties of the physical environment that tell us about land use. There's a whole suite of sociocultural characteristics that we actually need in order to inform any model of human-environment interactions and land use. So what can we predict on the basis of the environment? We can predict soil fertility or water resources. All these things can lead to estimates of something like crop yield, okay, which is obviously important for agricultural societies, but there's a whole bunch of things that we actually can't predict. We were talking about whether or not people are rational actors during the discussion this afternoon. Well, I don't think so. And this is as true for the past as it is for the present or the future. And so, but fortunately for the past, all of these kind of information can be more or less assessed or synthesized from the archaeological record. So it's very difficult to predict what people will do in the future, but at least for the past, we can more or less understand how their subsistence and livelihood and how their diet changed, how their technology changed, how their social organization changed, okay? And so just to give you an example of how we are tackling this problem, we're starting to build an atlas of sociocultural characteristics of the change in sociocultural characteristics over time that we can use to inform a land use model. And so we're mapping land use systems on the basis of archaeological and historical information. Here, just an example from West Africa. Okay, so you have the Sahara at the top, the Gulf of Guinea at the bottom, okay? And this is the Niger River, and what we have here are in 1800 BC, large areas occupied by non-farming people, so either pastoralists or hunter-gatherers, but a few areas where you have important farming societies, and you can see how that changes over time. So farming is spreading out over the landscape, and then it's intensifying. And so these more darker green colors refer to more intensive forms of agricultural exploitation, to the point where we get to, at the latest pre-colonial African period, large areas even being supported by some kind of engineered agriculture, rice paddies or raised field type of system. So it's an indication that people are changing the carrying capacity of their environment through changes in their subsistence livelihood. The other thing that we're looking at is land use for animal production. And so here are just the most important pasture animals or animals that graze or browse on landscapes. And in a paper that we published earlier this year, we started thinking about how you could organize these kind of animal production strategies into a system that would make sense for understanding or nuancing, understanding the differences in the different types of land use that actually occur depending on how people are raising their animals. And we've actually made a kind of first stab at mapping this over time as well. So here for 4000 BC, okay, we have various forms of extensive pastoralism, intensive pastoralism, and animal management through hunting, and you sort of see how that changes over time. So 2,000 years later, or at the latest sort of pre-colonial era, the distribution of different grazing animals or on the landscape. So these kind of things are all going to go into the suite of sociocultural characteristics, which can inform a model of human-environment interactions, and it can also be informed by things like climate change. And importantly, have a feedback loop, and it was kind of hard to see here, but a feedback loop between the way humans use their landscape and the properties of the physical environment. Okay? I think this is very important. So people already in the glacial time could influence the carrying capacity of their landscape by using fire to open it up, okay, which made that landscape a little bit more habitable for them. And this sort of process of niche construction or ecological engineering occurs throughout the late Quaternary. And so on the basis of this, we can model land use, we can model land cover, and we can actually model human populations, and we can evaluate those models in the context of archaeological reconstructions, historical information, and various kinds of paleo-environmental and paleo-biological archives like pollen, DNA, geochemical tracers. So I'm out of time. I'd just like to summarize, first of all, by hopefully I've managed to convince you that human activity has had a substantial impact on the biosphere since our evolution. Okay? We're not talking about something that starts with the Industrial Revolution. We're not talking about something that starts with the development of complex societies, civilizations, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. We are talking about the evolution and spread of people out of Africa. Persistent deforestation leads to continuous, oh, and you saw the animation, leads to continuous emissions of greenhouse gases from the land to the atmosphere, and some of those greenhouse gases end up staying in the atmosphere. And so I don't necessarily 100% agree with Rudderman's hypothesis that the Holocene record of atmospheric CO2 and methane are only caused by people. But on the other hand, we cannot ignore their influence on these greenhouse gases. There is something unique about the Holocene, and that is the fact that humans were present all over the planet during that time. And so finally, I'll just end with a comment on the Anthropocene. So I actually told you, I said, when does the Anthropocene begin? Well, what about the Anthropocene? Actually, I'm not too bothered about the Anthropocene. I'm not a stratigrapher, and if there are any in the room, I apologize. But I think that the Anthropocene is a very important political concept. I think it's very important for us to recognize that our influence on the global environment today is as important as changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun or plate tectonics in influencing the Earth system. We may never have another ice age because of human activity. Okay? So I do think that the Anthropocene in that way acknowledges the importance of our activities on the planet. When did it begin? I'm actually not too concerned about that. So I hope I didn't let you down. I'll leave that for you to decide for yourself. And with that, I'm very happy to take any questions, and thank you again for coming.